have some special guests. And our first guest is the Chief Information Security Officer, as well as the Vice President for Information Technology at Pomona, Mr. John McGuthry. And our second speaker, you already know him from yesterday, Mr. Matt Scholz from Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So I request Mr. John McGuthry to come on the podium and give a short remark for you guys.
Good morning, how are y'all doing? Good. Jacket off because I'm warm. But I'm going to get my notes out of my jacket so I don't. Now, these aren't my notes. These are my notes. I have a list of things that I have to do before I go home. If anyone is willing to go to the cleaners for me. All right. I happen to have the absolute best job in the world. And that job is to help the faculty who help students like you all. And it was neat. I had a chance to see this sign yesterday. I was every day during lunch. I walk up the hill. I breathe real hard. I sit down and then I walk back down the hill. I saw the sign. And it was neat. One, Cal Poly. Where are the Cal Poly students? You know, I saw Cal Poly. I saw the University of Maryland. I actually went to the University of Maryland as an undergraduate. I saw Georgia Tech. I went to Georgia Tech for grad school. I saw GW University. I also went to GW, but I didn't finish. I didn't like it. My dad was insistent on me studying engineering, electrical engineering, because he was an electrical engineer. And I didn't want to do it, and he brainwashed me into finally going to grad school for that. And I pouted, and I said, so what I wanted to share with you all is some of the advice that I was given when I was your age. The first piece of advice I was given was, if you wait long enough, all bad news turns to good news. You just have to be able to wait it out. I'm trying to tell my wife that every time something goes wrong. It will be good eventually. The internet will never be successful. $4K is just a fad. Right? I said $4K. Oh, okay. Unix will never amount to anything. Not only was I happen to have the pleasure of having a father that was an electrical engineer, he also was a CIO. And when I was in school, CIOs mostly dealt with payroll systems and HR-related activities. And so if I wasn't going to be an electrical engineer, he wanted me to be in IT, working on mainframes and coding mainframe stuff, which was very different from what I wanted to do. In 1994, I was told internet security will be solved, and so there's no need to focus on internet security. Get one job, focus on that company, and stay there your entire career. Be passionate about what you do. And the last piece of advice I was given is don't take everyone's advice. So, I tell you that because I really didn't have anything else interesting to tell you. But I also wanted to give you some advice that I wanted to share with you. And I want you all to take into account the advice that others told me. And so you can take it, you can use it, you can throw it away, or you can do whatever you want. So the first piece of advice that I would like to share with you is whenever you are out, whenever you are at a function, whenever you're someplace, meet 3 people, connect with those 3 people, stay in contact with those 3 people for at least 1 year, and ensure you're connected with them in your LinkedIn profile. 3 people. And these 3 people aren't 3 people that you traveled with that you never talked to. These are 3 people outside of your network. Second piece of advice that I'd like to give you is to write down the interesting things that happen to you. Keep a journal. Those interesting things that happen to you will be the stories that you tell as you progress in your career. And one of the things that I think will help make you successful is your ability to tell your story. Tell what you've learned. Tell what you've experienced. And to be able to tell it in such a way that's compelling and that will have people listen to you. Write down your stories, tell your stories, and practice telling your stories. The third and final piece of advice that I'd like to give to you is what you do right now and what you are going to be doing over the next couple of years is some of the most complicated, necessary, most important things that this country needs and is going to need to continue to thrive. However, most of the people in this country will never be able to understand what it is you do. So one of the things that I would love for you to practice doing is to be able to explain to everyone, the masses, what it is you do in easy language. When you're talking to someone, to folks that are unlike the folks in this room, to be able to explain it and practice doing that. So those 3 things: build your network, meet people, write down your stories. I had to look down and actually look at my story because I forgot for a second. Someone was making a face at me in the back of the room, so I stopped and stared and got hypnotized. Write down your stories and tell your stories. Finally, practice telling and making this so that everyone can understand. All right, are you all going to have a good weekend?
Oh, definitely.
Who wants to come to my house and help me cut grass? All right, 3 volunteers. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. So next up we have Mr. Matt Scholz presenting on the information security issues with the space network. So could you help me welcoming Mr. Matt on the podium?
Hey, good morning. So I did my own biased survey. The nice woman working at the front counter for the Kellogg Center, I asked her, well, about how many people have come in this morning? She said, oh, it's been busy. We've had more than 50. I said, all right. For every one of them, I saw you extend a cordial and civil greeting. How many of them returned that greeting? Congratulations. She said, literally nearly 90% of the people who came in, if she said good morning, they responded. It's amazing how we live these days with so much technology that allows such high touch and high interaction, and yet we're so much more uncivil they ever used to be. Every day I get on a bus at JPL to get around the campus, a bunch of people all storm on, and what do they all do as soon as they're on the bus? Come on, everybody knows. What do? Locked into their little mobile room. Absolutely no interaction. They don't even say hi to the bus driver. Now, maybe I'm just kind of silly, but I think the bus driver actually has intrinsic value as a human being and deserves a basic freedom. One of the challenges we find in cyber is we just get so locked down into the work and into finding the problems that we really forget, in many cases, what we're dealing with. At JPL, we have about 23% of our workforce as bachelors. That makes us the minority. People like me who have graduate degrees, we're in another percentile, but at least a third of the lab have doctorates. I mean, they are just rock star, brilliant types of people. And yet, they're still humans. So they might be the world's leading preeminent authority on a hybrid compound we're using to do polymer to titanium 3D printing in one pass. And yet, patching a system? I mean, their mind is so locked on their real problem that for them is trivial, and somebody ought to just do it. And you know who they think ought to do it? You. But just for a moment, let's think about cybersecurity in real life terms. For everybody in the room, how important is your money, no matter how little or how much you have? Well, family is the most important, I hope, and other things like your faith. But clearly, how many of you would leave your money just, say, out in small unmarked bills in a bushel basket in front of where you live? That's a great idea. And in my case, when I was your age, I wouldn't have needed a bushel basket. I mean, it would have been more like a Dixie cup. So, I ask myself and ask you a simple question. If your money's that important, how many of you have most of your money in, say, a credit union or a bank? Show of hands. Whatever we have. All right. So tell me, how many of you have created a 23 or longer character PIN for accessing your money in your bank? How many of you have changed it every 90 days? Okay, so let's get to the honest people in the room. So, if I pull out my debit card, when's the last time I changed that PIN?
No.
But cybersecurity is super important, right? I mean, and frankly, almost everything after reputation is about the monetization of threat and risk. And yet we don't even feel the need to change our PIN that often, which is direct access to all the resources we have. Huh. Okay, question 2. So in cyber, we basically try to set rules like secure configuration baselines, those types of things. We want people to follow them, right? We like the idea of the rule of law. Yes? Okay. I came here again this morning on my motorcycle. Any guesses? How long did I actually obey the speed limit coming here this morning? Well, it turns out that as I'm shifting up from first to second, that was the only time I actually stayed within a defined limit prescribed by law for which there are penalties. What's the penalty for violating the cybersecurity thing? To some degree, the weird thing about what really goes on in real life, even with things like ITAR, is best characterized like the British cop who says, "Stop, or I shall say, stop again." Consequences? Really? You're going to take down $1 billion or $2 billion mission because they didn't patch around your schedule? Real cyber is an interesting blend of these ideals that we set for how things ought to be versus that real world that says very few of us changed the PIN on our debit card in the last year, or 2 years, or 3 years. Almost none of us actually drove the speed limit in the last year. Unless, what? There was a cop. So a lot of people view cyber as the police force. And I'm here to tell you that if you want to be a cop, be a cop. Why am I in cyber, and hopefully why are most of you getting into cyber, besides the hope that you're going to have a job? are good. In most cases, I hope that there's a better reason. My reason really for getting into it is I don't like bullies. I don't like people who pick on people just because they don't know something that the other person knows. And if I really don't like that, what I viewed my job as was protecting people who frankly needed to focus on other tasks that they're absolutely tremendously brilliant at doing. Our partnership has to have a symbiotic relationship where I don't just show up as the department of no, which is what a lot of cyber is characterized as, but more the department that says, so let me get this straight. You want to take a craft that has never existed before. You want to bring it into the Martian atmosphere at about Mach 22, about 11,000 miles an hour. You want to expose it to about 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit conditions. And your landing radius is about 60 kilometers. And you have no idea, really, if you're going to land on a boulder, on a flat plane. And while you're doing all that, what I want to do is just help make sure that some idiot who wanted to be a hacker and watched a YouTube video and downloaded their Kali Linux distro thought it might be fun to see what they could do by trying to overload a buffer for command upload on a spacecraft. So, the real job, as I see it, of cyber is not, it's not just for us to be hackers. Think about it more as you're going to get to focus your energies on learning vulnerabilities that, frankly, other folks don't even pay attention to. And you need to think like the hacker to understand how those are going to be exploited. Because your goal is not just to do a drive-by and go, you guys suck because you got a vulnerability and you're not patching fast enough. Your job is actually to be that brother who says, I'm not going to let it happen to you. I'm here because I'm going to help make sure we complete the mission successfully. When I look at what we're doing for the Deep Space Network, it's hard to see because of the light. So this is real-time operations out of the Deep Space Network facilities. So in Madrid, we're talking to OSIRIS-REx. So that's our spacecraft that's going to go look at a comet and try to actually grab a sample and bring back a big hunk of it. That's kind of a neat project. You can see that we're kind of quiet at Goldstone. Our primary 73-meter dish is talking to Dawn. Dawn is another one of those wild spacecraft where 3 of the 4 wheels that are actually used to position it are all broken, and yet we're still operating it. Kind of neat. So, in real time, what we can tell is the type of information, whether it's command and control or data, which spacecraft off of which antenna. Now, here's the part, if you're thinking cyber, that should be terrifying. This is public sector. So, any person on the planet can go look at Eyes on the DSN and pull this stuff up. Now, if you wanted to be bonus terrified, off on this side, we have details about things like the antenna, what its transmit and receive offset frequencies are, the type of data. What we don't give is the actual command dictionary. I mean, there's a line that you don't want to cross that way. But one would argue, wow, this is like really, really dumb, because you guys are advertising to the hackers exactly when you're communicating to different spacecraft, and even from which antenna. And those numbers are the real antenna numbers. If I go out to Goldstone and I look at Mars, or 73-meter dish, that is literally antenna 14. So the rubric is right there. Well, we must be idiots. Or, in a business that has to communicate ideas about science to improve mankind's welfare and longevity. And part of that communication involves doing things like this to let the world know what's going on, so we can celebrate innovation that still occurs. Cyber's job is to just help make sure that this knowledge doesn't become weaponized. And that's really the job. So when I think about space and the challenges we have, one of the ones that I mentioned briefly yesterday was you have a spacecraft like Voyager. Voyager had to be flight rated in 1974. Think about what encryption standards existed in 1974. It launched in 1977. Off it went. Voyager has a total operating power of 23 watts. It takes about 38 hours and 11 minutes for the signal to come back, and it's one way. It's not digital, it's analog. We're still dealing with Ka, X, and S-band to talk. But why? Well, I don't know. How many of you are getting good cell phone reception from, say, more than 11 billion miles? Voyager is. So one of the challenges we have is our signal is really coming from a long distance. We have older technology. We have some very new stuff, but we got legacy systems. So if you're a good cyber person, you would talk to them and you would do an assessment of risk and you'd say things like, well, you should be doing multi-factor authentication. Cool. Their OS doesn't support it. You should patch all the time. Well, the software is all custom and it's running on an operating system that went end of life almost 18 years ago. Well, then you should put it inside of a container. Isolate. Okay, if you never want to hear from spacecraft again, isolate it. Turns out that a lot of our early missions had that problem. They would actually get their telemetry off because of some sort of failure, and nothing in them had a phone home technology, and they would simply drift because their antenna never pointed anywhere near Earth again to ever get picked up to relock on signal. That's a learning process that you go through. So in cyber, what we've been doing is investing our time to understand the characteristics of things like the deep space network, how we do command and control, how a spacecraft command file is put together. And then what we think about is, well, what's the real risk? And when you talk risk to a mission person, you got to understand, you're talking to people who, they know risk. I mean, if you've never listened to the original John F. Kennedy speech that he made about going to the moon, the end of that speech, he says a couple things that are just mind-boggling. He says, quote, "We're going to launch a rocket bigger than has ever existed before, made out of metal that doesn't exist today. We're going to go in at a speed 10 times faster than any human has ever seen, and 20 times hotter than any human has ever endured." Risk? I mean, they were going to fry people and expose them to forces that they had never, ever understood. And that was the challenge of the original Apollo people. So when I talk risk with a mission, these are people who get risk. What they really want to understand from you is what's the right balancing effect to minimize the potential for a really severe incident that would either take their spacecraft out of commission or that would hurt the reputation of JPL or the overall NASA agency. And that's really what they want to know. And if what you come back with is, well, the federal government instituted CDM, which says scan every system that exists every 72 hours and mitigate all vulnerabilities. How many of you are pretty comfortable doing simple math? 40,000 systems scanned every 72 hours. If you were doing, say, a source code scan, static or dynamic code, plus patching vulnerabilities, on average you're going to see 1,100 vulnerabilities pop up. Times 40,000, and you're going to issue a fix-it ticket for every single one. And every 72 hours, you're going to issue a new one. In less than a week, you've generated just over 6.7 million tickets to the text that say, "I'm the most important thing going on." If you had to guess what the average tech does with 6.7 million fix-it tickets, what would you guess they do? They either pipe it all to dev null, or they set up a mailbox with a folder and an inbox rule that says, "Just send it." So, when I think about cyber, a lot of the traditional things that we thought about for basic blocking and tackling, they need to be challenged by the idea that economies of scale make you think differently. You have to think differently. And in cyber, what you really have to think about is, You're going to come into the room with a guy who invented the instrument on that spacecraft. You are not going to tell him how his instrument works. That's just not going to happen. What you're going to do is use your knowledge about vulnerabilities, but balance it with the understanding that you sped on the way there and you got money out of the ATM machine using a pin that's 3 years old before you harsh on him because he's not patching every 72 hours. The real job in cyber, as I see it these days, is an overwhelming rate of pace of Dockerized and virtualized systems being spun up, and you having to help people do the right thing, and the right thing isn't always to do a long-term invasive scan and a required patch for any CVE above a 9. What you're going to have to think about is really good cyber people, the types that we want at JPL, is what do you do when Voyager is down to one person running the entire spacecraft, and they don't know anything about cyber? What do you do? If your answer is you work with them to help them understand what the potential risks are and potential ways to mitigate, but what you really do is you step up and you say, you know what? They're not going to do the thing that is obvious. We have to be smarter about automating and instrumenting our means of detection of an attack and how we're going to channel it differently to simply minimize the potential for its success. Real cyber has to be that you, as the really smart people about cyber, become their real partners by saying, I get that you can't patch for a year a critical vulnerability. What I'm going to do is jump into our IDS and into our Palo Altos, and I'm going to set up alerts and Splunk that you get a view of, a real-time dashboard, so you could see if things are going to crap, so that if we show up and say we got to take your system off of the network, that it really feels like a partnership. If all we do is scan and send tickets, pipe it to dev null is the reaction we're going to get. So, going to the missions, learning how they speak and how they think, critical. As far as space goes, I could talk about some of the protocols we use, but it should be very clear from comments yesterday that things like Space Link Extension, which is used to communicate to everything outside of low Earth orbit, is a completely unencrypted protocol. Wait, encryption? I mean, we're supposed to encrypt things, right? Well, yeah, where you can, it's a great idea. Should we do multi-factor auth? Absolutely. Where you can, you should. The biggest challenge that I find for cyber is when we get to larger and larger scale, you'll always have that anomaly, that condition where this system couldn't support it. But if you stop the discussion there at, oh, so you can't do multi-factor, you're not doing your job. Your job is to look at that access vector and figure out what to do to mitigate it in a smart way. Real world, recent example that is not a good story coming from a certain country. They were using not a default password, but a very simple password to access a database that had telemetry data on it. How many of you have scanned databases for password vulnerabilities? Couple, good. Guess what Oracle does with every password? In the actual database, they end up padding it so that it becomes incomprehensibly long, even if the actual password is only 6 characters, all alpha. How do you test in that condition? Those are the real world cyber things that we face. And smart people like you who don't just stop at the easy download Metasploit, get the packages, run the scan based on an Nmap scan that you did. We're going to need smarter people who say, you know what, the problem of database vulnerability can be solved. It's just not an obvious path. Most of what we do, nobody ever did before in existence because it wasn't an obvious path. The fix on the Hubble telescope was a 6'5" JPLer who was in a shower in Germany. Because he's really tall, they had one of those elbowed extension shower heads. As he stood under the shower, he looked up and he realized, holy crap, if I simply change my aperture focal point, I can correct the deficiency in the mirror on Hubble. The real rescue of Hubble was simply that a guy who was too tall for a standard shower, his mind was always on the problem, but it wasn't until that physical connection to a problem that he had developed a solution. What you should, if you take anything away from me, it's download and run all the various tools to do your job well. Learn not just basic scanning, but vulnerability exploits and blocking and tackling defenses. Do it with open source stuff, because open source will force you to understand the concept better than the packaged, marketed solution that comes from a security vendor. Our challenges in space are simply, we've got command and control, telemetry, science data distribution, and the bonus for us at JPL is once you leave Earth orbit, there is no other game in town. If you're JAXA, we're running your spacecraft. We're flying it, we're doing its operations, we're the ones actually doing all of the telemetry and framing of your data and the distribution out of JPL, which means we're on the hook for lots of different nations to interact. And that's a challenging problem in the federal space, because the federal space only understands US citizen or US person. For us, when I got up this morning, Goldstone was completely dead. Everything that was going on was happening out of Canberra, Australia, and Madrid, which means Australians and Spaniards were running the Deep Space Network. That's the real world that I think you're really coming into, is one of the need for federated identities and federated access, because the world has a bunch of really smart people, it turns out. And the more we actually bring them into things that benefit humankind, I think that the better the turnout and the outcome is. So I hope a few of the comments about what we're facing make a little bit of sense. If you haven't gone to the site, this is a fun site. If you do hit the NASA missions page, you'll find lots of neat things. If you wanted a real-time connection of what's going on with most of our missions, we have a lot of that stuff there. And frankly, if you're just starting to look at what we do, 17 different current spacecraft all operating. We've got another 11 more coming in the next 8 years. Lots to do. And frankly, we could use a hand. The challenges of automating and integrating across tools, as I had mentioned yesterday, are one of the biggest things we've got to solve. And we're going to need smart people who don't just do what the vendor says. We need people who actually get out of that box and figure out the interconnections that really leverage the competencies of these different tools that are good, but in isolation insufficient to tell you if you've really got a problem on your hands. Vulnerabilities and vectors of access are the core of what we really do. And in cyber, we're supposed to know what those are so that we can at least help predict them in a reasonable way and help defend for these really, really smart people who might have an astrophysics PhD, but the concept that somebody would ever attack a buffer and overflow it or cause a memory bank failure on a rover, it's simply unthinkable. So think like the bad guys, but get into the business because you actually wanted to stop bullies from doing stuff to people who really didn't challenge them, who simply wanted to do something good that would benefit mankind. Why should you work at JPL? Because it's the coolest place to work and beyond. It really is. I mean, I like working for IBM, but I really love the product at JPL. And the neat thing is, you walk up to somebody there, like you heard the advice to make some contacts, and you just ask them, what do you do? Oh, I'm a dark matter expert. Wikipedia, it is just awesome. So have fun, jump in, www.jpl.nasa.gov. And our challenges with space, if you join the team, we'll get to the classified level and show you some of the real interesting things. Are there real bad guys out there? Yeah. But the majority of the problems we face are human error that exposes data that's sensitive, or frankly, the person who is kind of a tier 1, tier 2 hacker who thought it'd be cool to deface a site to show off. So we do have real nation-state challenges. We're doing our best to deal with those. And if you become part of the team, you'll get to work your way into meetings with people who do some really, really wonderful stuff, and it'll inspire you to want to help them continue to do wonderful stuff.
agenda today. The NSA representatives have requested us to move up their talk from evening to the lunch time. So they have, after their talk, they have a lot more time because they felt that last night, a lot of you were waiting to talk to them. So we're moving their talk up the lunchtime. So please make sure that you take note of that change. The NSA talk to you at the lunchtime. And right after the lunch, we'll have a group picture taken in this room, right in front of the podium. So please make sure that you don't miss that opportunity. And next thing will be dispersing in different groups. So the pen testing workshop group will remain in this room. The digital forensics group will go to room Mountain Vista 2, right across the auditorium on the left-hand side. And the cryptographic group will go to Mountain Vista 1, which is right across the auditorium, right-hand side. Okay. Once you get to the room, there will be organizers who are going to help you sign in for the sessions, and they will give you colored wristbands as a form of weak authentication. But that's it for now. So I'll see you guys for lunch.